Welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think, a podcast project that seeks to find wisdom in conversation through the stories and personal reflections of regular people like you and me. My name is Ariane Rice, and I'm really grateful you're here. So let's get started. My intentional conversation partner today is the Reverend Mark Robin Collins. Mark is an Episcopal priest. He is rector of a flourishing congregation in Glen Rock, New Jersey. He is a very active and involved participant in the Episcopal Diocese of Newark. He is also an AIDS activist. He is also somebody who recently celebrated 35 years in recovery. Is that the right way to say it?
Yep.
35 years. And he is a very talented writer, an amazing preacher. But of course, his most important accolade, besides also being married to the most wonderful Denton Stargirl for the last how many years?
27.
27. Besides all those accolades, he's my BFF.
There we go.
That's why he's on this podcast.
There you go.
So, Mark, did I miss anything in that intro that you would like to add?
You put the right gloss on it. It's like you could also add been in tons of therapy, badly needed, and all of those other things. But I like the way you spun it. I like your PR spin on it. It's good.
Since releasing this podcast, and now when this comes out, it will be episode 11, which I'm super excited about because that's just a huge number to me. Yes, and being a friend who encouraged me and said on that podcast that I do a really good job of running with scissors. I feel like that's exactly what I'm doing and managing to not hurt anybody in the process, which is a good thing.
Or yourself.
Or
yes.
Myself, or thankfully myself. And one of the most wonderful aspects of the feedback I received from not a few, but several people after that went into the universe, our conversation, was so many people told me that they found themselves getting a little bit emotional as they listened to our conversation, with tears coming to their eyes or a lump in their throat. Wow. And that was a wonderful affirmation for exactly what I want to be sharing in this podcast. I think we need some more spaces where we encourage people to get in touch with those parts of themselves. And another piece of the feedback that I heard was how much people appreciated hearing you share that intense and also funny to you and I story of your therapist, speaking of therapy, and getting in touch with the reality of your parent,
right,
and how they were doing the best they can with the tools they have.
Yeah, that whole evolution, because I've just since I last saw you on your podcast, I've been to see my dad, who's 88 and doing pretty good, but he's starting to he has fewer years ahead of him than behind him, and it puts me back in touch with how much of a evolution my relationship with both of my parents, but particularly my addicted parent, has been over my whole life. And thank God, there's no point, my inner understanding of my growing up and my parenting and all that stuff, there's no point in the past that I wish I stayed at. Every next step was help me understand them, and then also kind of become the person I am, not the child of an addict and an alcoholic. There's so many things about me. There's so many things about the way I react to things I'm an adult child of an alcoholic. I'm a leopard who can't change those spots. But at the same time, I don't have to act out of that part of my history. And as the decades since I was in the house with a recovering alcoholic, with an active addict, I kind of look at myself sometimes in the mirror and go, okay, you know why you're feeling that. You know why you're reacting that way. You're the child of an alcoholic. And you left that home 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. How about let's stop for a second and act out of the person the life you built, the person that you are, in these 40 years and not those first 20, roughly speaking. So the whole point, every step along the way has been amazing.
So, one of the things I'm learning as I get into doing this more is how quickly I want to get right into the heart of things. And you and I do that all the time
Bring it on, Ariane.
So, well, you and I kind of got to some of that towards the end of the conversation in terms of talking about the way in which we view and have we maintain a relationship with our parents and with our families long after we've moved out of the house and moved on with our lives. This is, they stay with us internally. And one of the things I'm getting, frankly, just a little bit more clarity on, and hopefully a little more courage, is a belief that there is a very important connection here in terms of our faith and our feelings. And leaving the church, I think, has a lot to do with the church doesn't serve most people anymore because there's such a immature way in which we relate to our faith. And I don't mean that in a way I certainly don't want to be insulting of anyone, but you and I were in the exact same classroom when our professor stood up and said, you need to be prepared that everybody in your pews will have the theological education that ceased when they were 14 years old.
Yeah, if that. Yeah.
But they started learning about God. They learned about Jesus. They learned about the stories that you and I study, pretty intensely while their parents make them go to church, and then they get confirmed or their first communion or whatever that ritual is going to be, or their families just stop going because, and they're done. And we don't live in a world that really encourages a lot of education after that. And certainly, I don't know about you, but my experience in seminary was meeting Jesus again for the first time, reading the Bible again for the first time, learning everything that I had no awareness of, even though I grew up a very faithfully practicing Roman Catholic, in the family I grew up in. So,
all right, hang on a minute. I got a lot to say about that.
Okay. Well, that's kind of like what I really want to focus on in this conversation.
Here's a lot of what I think about this. And some of this comes from my perspective as a gay person who is a person of faith as well. Because there are plenty of my gay folk who are like my gay siblings who are like, oh, what do you do? You're a traitor. You've been brainwashed into going along with this oppressive system that is 100% corrupt, 100% has no value in the modern world, only exists to make money and manipulate people. Like they have so I get a lot of that out in the gay world. And, with good reason, they come by it honest, but there's something true about what they say, true to their experience. But, one of the things recently, I just met with this wonderful priest at our clergy conference, Beth Wyndham. She's a church planter in Texas, and she has a new church that's filled with people who have been hurt, who have been, maybe they would say, damaged by evangelical religion. And so far as I know, the majority of them are straight. So it's not something that gay people really own. But I think one of the things that's in American culture in the 20th century, who knows about the 21st, but in the 20th century, religion and family became so immersed that religion became a parenting tool. It became a parenting tool. And so when your child challenged you in adolescence, which was when I began my adolescent rebellion, my parents are like, who is this monster? They had no idea. And they weren't allowed that process themselves, or else they hid it in one aspect of their lives and, as my mother did, enacted it out in others. So there was no expectation that I would begin to separate from them, that I would challenge their ideas, that I would dress differently, and that they would be accepting and encouraging of me discovering who and what I was. None of that happened. And the higher authority they could call on was the authority of religion, of God, that I would, So when parents have their authority really challenged, often what they do is they call on God. And you try to use that authority to control their children. And one of the things I know about being human is, and you spoke about us continuing our relationships with our parents, and I think that's an authentic thing. There's a line in Judith Rosner's book, August, a novel about a therapy. And she talks about one of her analysans, one of her patients, saying she didn't want to talk about her parents. She didn't have anything to do with her parents. And the line is something like, and she refused to admit that the person she had lain next to in the first days of her life had anything to do with who she was.
Oh, that's awesome. Let's say that.
Isn't that?
So let me get that. She refused to admit that the person she leaned next to in the first days of her life had anything to do
with who she was.
Yeah.
So, we can't, I think in other better psychological minds have put this better, but we never really reject our parents. Even the most horrible abusive parent, we can't ever let go of. And that's horrible. It's a ball and chain in many respects that we can never really break free of. But it's also a tether, I think, that binds us, so that when the time comes along and I've got this authoritarian parent and I can't really cut the tie, because human beings can't really do that. What I can do is find something they hold very sacred and completely reject it. I will completely reject it.
Well, yeah, because you're also rejecting a metaphor of God as parent, because Jesus is our father.
Our woefully inadequate, of course, family metaphor for
family God, metaphor, which of course also culturally, historically, traditionally been made into an incredibly heteronormative, and in some ways, I will just say
patriarchal.
Well, obviously patriarchal, but then also somewhat ick producing factor of Jesus Christ as married to his bride, the church, which kind of makes me gag in my mouth a little bit every time I hear the metaphor. Yeah.
Nobody says anymore. Do they say that anymore?
Well,
stop saying that if you're saying that.
If you're reading the beginning of the wedding service in the Book of Common Prayer, you're saying it, which is why I never use that opening. I only use the one.
Used that in a lot.
Right, because we use the one from the same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called now? I don't even know what is it called now. The one I used, the one that you said at my wedding.
Yeah, it's called the good one. We call it the good one, marriage right.
The good one, the good marriage right.
I know. I have a little mixed feelings about that. Like, the church authorizes for use this same-sex marriage liturgy, and all the straights are like, "Hey, we like this better too," and we're like, "Damn it, can't we have one thing for us?"
So, and you just said something that's really great. That's exactly, I think, what we're supposed to keep having as we are older in all our relationships. I have mixed feelings about it, and so this idea of complete and utter rejection of the church, complete and utter rejection of our parents is, it's too extreme, and it's in some ways it's an immature way of being.
Well, that's the thing about human love. Human love becomes part of us. When we love, that feeling it's not like warm and cold that goes away when the conditions around us. If we truly love, we love a part of us forever. And, all the, I want to say victims, but really just people I dated back in the day, I try to think of them now, and there's conflict, and they did this and I did that, and, all of those kind of things. But, I gained something from each of those experiences. There weren't that many, by the way, but because I had to prove to myself that I could love. So I know that the feelings I have, whether they're occasionally resentment or whatever it is now, they're proof of love, like proof of life. They talk about when there's a kidnapping, they're proof of love and my ability to love. And until I found someone worthy of that love who could return that love, not in kind, in a different way, but could return that love in the way that I needed to be loved.
So I was saying, like, Arian, you better also bring some lightness to this conversation, because it's getting pretty.
Why? We do this all the time.
I know we do.
We used to talk on the phone, and you would say, we should make this a podcast. And here we are. And,
so this.
Suck it up, podcast listeners. This is how it goes.
Well, let's see. Two things. First of all, I posted on Facebook today an op-ed from today's New York Times. Today's the 28th of October when we're recording this. And it was David Brooks, who I have mixed feelings about too, but relate to much of what he says. He wrote an article about, well, I can just remember the concluding sentence, which is the emotional health of our world is shattering. And it's all based on data around the world of, people naming how pained they are physically and emotionally, how lonely they are, how anxiety ridden they are, just very, very dark, difficult emotions. He also had a fascinating statistic about looking at pop songs between 1965 and now. And the word love, as you were just speaking of, is down by half in the title of pop songs. And there's a lot more anger. And he referenced, Taylor Swift's recent album and how she doesn't dress for women. She doesn't dress for men. She dresses for revenge is a lyric in one of her songs. And, all well and good and all one aspect of the entire world and soup in which we swim in. But again, this idea about faith and feelings, and also that claim that many, many parents, myself included, and not even just parents, but that people utilize the church for, is, I think, to distance us from thinking of our feelings as places where we are supposed to find God. Certainly. I mean, when we think about what religion is and what spirituality is and what a tradition is, I think most of us think about, okay, well, what do we believe? What does that tradition believe? What does that tradition say about how we're supposed to operate in the world? What does it tell us we're supposed to do to be good, to follow the rules and the framework of that religion? And yet, even this morning, as I was spending time reading Richard Rohr talking about nonviolence, and he was pointing to the Beatitudes and Sermon on the Mount, I was like, all of these blessings, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who weep. Everything's feelings. Everything's feelings. And church, like the experience of church, like when you and I say church and think of coming somewhere on a Sunday, it is a choreographed, scripted, practiced way of being in a community of people that I think sometimes allows space for there to be some feelings. Sometimes somebody there is able to name that either in a sermon or perhaps with a certain prayer, or even maybe in an announcement that is shared by a member of the community about something that's happening in the life of that community.
Or a hymn, those old hymns
yes.
who nobody likes the words and nobody likes the music, but there's a powerful feeling there.
And so much, a feeling in the memory. I mean, I think church also represents it just represents something for many of us that we can't even really put words around, because it's just been a part of the fabric of our lives.
Well, but also in our tradition, which is a Eucharistic tradition, the very heart of that service is an act of memory, of anamnesis, I believe. I've never pronounced that word right. Anamnesis, where we, do these things in remembrance of me. We say, this is my body, this is my blood, as Jesus did at the Last Supper. So memory is at the core of it, at the core of our coming together. But I don't think we're supposed to get lost in that memory. And, nostalgia is the enemy of any kind, is the thief of today and the enemy of the future.
Yes, definitely. Yes. And so this is, okay. So this is what I wrote down. I wrote down two things. Well, first
I'm going to go back to, let me go back to David Brooks, which I haven't read, but I'll have an opinion on, because that's who we are. But, I was thinking lately about how back in the 60s, right, when, there were mental health and healthcare was just sort of a little bit coming out into, it had been 50 years since Freud, more or less, maybe a little bit more than that, but they're starting to be practitioners. Masters and Johnson were doing their work. People were starting to have a more public, a more acknowledged understanding of things. And there was in the 1960s, sort of late 60s, early 70s, huge increase in the number of cases of schizophrenia. So that generation of medical professionals and others, social scientists, looked around and said, oh my God, these kids, what's going on? It must be those psychedelic drugs, because psychedelic drugs produce a schizophrenic type, you have hallucinations, you have some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. And, there was a big panic, like drugs are making our kids crazy. Well, calmer minds looked around and said, yeah, but all the kids doing that don't become schizophrenic. What could be different? What could be different? And sure enough, it was the baby boom and something they didn't yet know, which was schizophrenia tends to manifest in early adulthood, in late adolescence and early adulthood. So we had a huge population of people who were all going through late adolescence, and or biggest generation at that point in American history, in world history. So they confused one aspect of what was going on with just the demographics of the situation. When David Brooks talks about the world is emotionally unwell, I'm not so sure that we haven't gone through something catastrophic in the past couple of years, and everybody gave themselves permission to be something outside of themselves, gave themselves permission to feel anxious. And now everybody's allowed in a new way to admit that they're feeling anxious. I'm not so sure that anything in the world is going any worse than it ever did. In fact, if you look at some of those statistics, people will tell you there are more people with access to clean water, more people with access to education, more people with access to medical care.
Yep.
Not enough.
And,
not enough.
And sorry, I'm interrupting, because when you do read it, you also see, not to negate anything you're saying, he does point to rise. The poverty is part of this. Poverty and the disparity that is continuing to increase between rich and
wealth
poor.
gap. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get personal and talk about these stories of our emotional shattering and how they connect with faith and feelings. And I wrote down a phrase that I have been somewhat definitely attracted to and think about all the time. And, you know, one of the things that's so interesting about our work is you and I literally say the exact same things most Sundays. And anytime you and I are doing, you know, a service of a certain type, we're saying the same words. So, you know, we have this experience of not only do we do the same job, but sometimes we're literally saying the same thing. And would you agree that saying these words, even if they're words we pretty much know by heart at this point, it like changes you? It's weird, right?
The phrase that we, you know, the sort of the theological tenet, I guess, that we learned in seminary is that praying shapes believing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of our tradition, the Anglican tradition. The Episcopal Church is a branch of that tradition. And we don't tell everybody how to believe. We instead have a manual of how to pray, and it follows a pattern of prayer that's very ancient, keeps getting updated. And we say those words in common with other people. I mean, the thing that strikes me about it is not that we're by rote reciting the same things, but that I can, you know, sometimes I can really connect to that feeling that I'm part of people all over the world on a Sunday morning, invoking God's presence, asking God's forgiveness, begging God to be present and to heal us in the same language, some of the same language, different languages, but same language.
But I doubt you even say it by rote. I think you and I probably say it like we're trying to actually say it in the moment that we are saying some of these words.
Yes. Send your Holy Spirit upon these gifts is one of my big ones. I try to be really present for that one.
So right before you get to that part of the, you know, and this is, by the way, one of the ways in which I think we can very easily separate our feelings from our faith is to get incredibly specific in the terminology we use. Like you just referenced, you know, not being able to say mnesis or whatever the word is that means memory.
Anamnesis, I think.
Whatever it is. And like, I don't, you know, this is called, you know, feeling beings who think, because we privilege thinking so much. And Freud, who you mentioned earlier, he termed that a secondary defense. A secondary defense from our ego or from our superego is intellectualism. And man, you and I encountered that in seminary, right?
Aren't we doing it right now, more or less?
All right. So here's the phrase. So every Sunday, most Sundays, we have different prayers that we say when we, you know, do the mojo magic and make Jesus's body and blood come to life on the altar. It's not that, I know. I'm being facetious.
Consecrate the bread and wine.
Yes.
To be. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. we say, we're talking about Jesus and we say, he shared our human nature.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Like that. And today I was thinking, for a variety of reasons, in my own prayer time, which included walking and listening actually to a podcast by James Finley, I was thinking about, wow, you know what? Kind of like crucifying Jesus was one of our ways of being like, you know what, God, we don't want you to share our human nature. We want no part of trying to live this naked in our vulnerability with how hard it is to live life, how gloriously wonderful it is, like how beyond, vulnerable producing the joy is, and how devastatingly sad and sorrowful and disappointing it is too. Like, thanks, no thanks.
Yeah, there's I love that part too. It shared our human nature, became one of us. And we've talked about, sometimes when I'm preaching and there's an opportunity to speak about that, I try to talk about Jesus as our brother, our sibling, and for the time in which he was on the earth. And there's a part of us that, in Anglicanism, our theology it has a big emphasis on incarnation. That and one of the archbishops of Canterbury, whose name I always mix up, said, it's not so much that God lowered God's self to become human, but God became human for all of us to lift ourselves up, to help us realize that what Paul said, that we are but little lower than the angels. And we'd much rather bend the knee, to use the Game of Thrones thing. We'd much rather grovel and hope that God will be this different thing way above us, that's pure and divine and unsullied by our base humanity, and that we can attain to that maybe someday in the end of the world, rather than say, oh no, God is here in this messiness. God is not going to fix me. God's not going to, make the pain go away. God is going to join me in it. Okay. We don't want that God.
No, we don't. So I'm going to invite you to listen to me share a little story of my own experience of this. And then that's coming to me as you're talking. And I want to know, because I know you do, I just don't know what it is right now, or what of the many experiences in your own life this was made true. So when I think about one of the experiences in which this was made true, it was a hard experience. It was someone who, I knew in my life as a priest, and they had such a horrific accident happen, recently retired, and we're at the beach and we're standing out looking at the beautiful ocean when a wave smacked them down.
Wow.
Broke their neck. And they could have died in the water, but they were resuscitated and brought to the hospital. And then I got the call from the family. He's in the hospital, but he's not really with us. And we've decided, we're going to end the life-sustaining treatment. And can you come be with us? So you make the long drive. It was a 3-hour drive to this hospital. And then being with a family that was akin to my family growing up, because it was 3 daughters. So I had that feeling out of it. It was also 1 month after my sister had died and ended her life. So that was close to my heart. And it was, so I was there for the day, right? I mean, I was there with the family for the day, and you know how that feeling happens. And all of us know this, has nothing to do with me, a clergy person. When you're in these moments, time isn't time.
Right.
And there's no sense of any space in the world other than the space you are inhabiting with these people and in this moment and what you're experiencing. You don't think about anything else, right? It's completely full of you. And
no, somebody will go over to the window and you'll suddenly realize it's dark. and you got there at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
Time ceases to exist.
And if you're the person who's there in some sort of professional caregiving capacity, you're also being more attentive to wanting to be caring, right? And being like, oh my gosh, like I'm feeling some of these feelings, and these people, how can I be as helpful to them, as supportive as possible? And the grandson of this person, who came regularly to church, and who at the time I think was like 9, 10, 8, kid person. Oh, so him sitting with me in the waiting room. Why is God doing this? Why, that this will make me cry thinking about it. And just to be able to sit there as the adult and to say, I don't know, and to listen to the grandparent that was alive, that was soon to be a widow, to listen to the grandparent, to listen to the parent and the 2 aunts, give answers that, whatever, they didn't even matter. None of those answers mattered, because this child was angry, like had no problem really showing their anger. And then being with this family, and we sang Amazing Grace as we watched, the breath stop. And I know I didn't really cry with the family, because you kind of have this ability to hold it together.
Right.
And I called a neighbor to take care of my daughter, because I knew she was coming home from school. She was in 3rd grade at the time, I think. And I remember getting into the car and collapsing.
Oh my God. My steering wheel has seen so many of my tears. So many. I mean, you try, you're there to be present for other people and their feelings. Yeah. And my steering wheel is my witness. Yeah. To the feelings that it evokes in us. Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I'm so overcome with feelings. I just heard myself snort into this microphone. Like, oh my God. So I eventually I pulled it together, and I just remember going home and going to the neighbor, and I told them what had happened, but it was also a lot. I can't even imagine but they were just like, okay, well, we got pizza for your daughter, and and they I could tell they wanted my daughter out of the house. They needed to get on with their nights.
Yeah. And I didn't take her to raise, take her home. Okay,
yeah. And I just went home, and I just I think I just sat on my couch for 30 minutes, in stunned of what happens with all this kind of stuff. And anyway, so, and even that whole experience, even following through and being with the family through the funeral. And I will say, because I haven't had it happen since, but after that particular funeral, we walked outside, and we did have to go and bury. It was a body. It was not just ashes. And there was a huge rainbow over the church.
Wow. Nice.
I was just like, God, come on. Could not, but that stuff happens, right? It
does happen. Yeah.
But that was one of the first, I think that was I just remember some of these early experiences. Yeah. Where I realized I was going to have to be a feeling priest who could think, not just one or the other, which of course all happened after my sister Christiana died. Everything changed in my life.
Of course.
Yeah. So anyway,
and I remember before that experience, I remember you having, as we all did, the first summer after your first year of seminary, the traditional part of the curriculum is that you go to a hospital, you work more or less full time for nearly 3 months as a hospital chaplain. You get your training of how to be present in situations. Let's put exactly like your big
quotes, quotes, please. Okay.
You get your experience
of
being present. Some training is good, some training is not. I wonder how good it can be. I mean,
exactly. That's what my training I think was great, but I wouldn't call it training. Exactly right. A supervised experience.
A supervised experience. It's like I'm the lifeguard and I'm throwing you in the deep end of the pool. Yeah. But you, they come those things. I remember this is a little bit of a preview of that kind of experience. It was February of 2002. And I had taken a month off of work that February to, at the suggestion of my PTSD counselor, after having been through September 11th, she said, you need some time. So I took that month off. And part of the time I spent at a monastery. And I was just beginning to kind of maybe intuit, maybe have a feeling that I had a vocation to ordained ministry. And so I snuck away to this Episcopal monastery where it was a silent retreat. So I didn't have to talk to anybody about anything. So I could think about maybe having this call without nobody seeing me do it, right? And it just so happened that there was someone that you have a talking meal at the beginning of your 5 days of silence with all the other individuals who are there. And someone was telling a story about their CPE, that summer training that we do, clinical pastoral education. And they did it at Massachusetts General Hospital. And there was the supervisor of that program was a nun. And according to this description, the class, looked exactly like a nun, couldn't be anything but a nun, sweet little old lady, right? Who said her prayers every day without fails. And she gets these, young people, often, not always, right out of a year of seminary who've, now read a theologian and know everything, as we thought we did after the first year of seminary. And she says to them, I want you to know that you're here not to help the wounded but because you are wounded. Mm-hmm. Nobody comes this pathway without their own wounds. And you may not know that. And if you don't, you're going to find out, and it's going to be harder for you. But if you do know that, what you're going to experience here is serving the wounded out of your own wounds. It will be you'll only be authentic. You'll only be real. You'll only be able to help if your presence comes from your own woundedness. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that. It's up to yours to take it and to come out the other end. So,
So let's hear the experience, Mark Collins.
What's my experience with that? Okay,
go ahead.
I'm going to give you another experience.
Okay.
When it comes to feelings, feelings and faith is our topic for today. And that's a very powerful one for you. Another one from the other end of the spectrum is, when I grew up in my drug addicted household, part of the messages I got about my ability to love were that they were insufficient. Because if I loved my mother enough, she wouldn't feel the things she felt that made her take drugs. That was the implicit message in my childhood. It's the implicit message in every alcoholic household. Yeah. Your children are trying to fix you because they feel that somehow if they were better kids, you wouldn't have your problems. Mm-hmm. I can see you trying to interrupt me.
Well, because I'm like, I don't know that in my household, I would assign my parents that responsibility so much as that's my interpretation as a child. As a child, I interpret your behavior that something must be wrong with me, or there's got to be something I could do to fix and solve this.
Right, because you need your parents to be all powerful gods who can take care of you. So therefore, if there's a problem, you must be the problem.
Right.
So exactly that. It's a child's interpretation of the situation. That's why it was so helpful later on to have somebody say, what are you shocked about? This is your mom. Mm-hmm. Your mom has always been this mess. Nonetheless, so I'd always had this feeling that I didn't know how to love, that my love was insufficient, that I didn't know what it was. I was confused about what it meant to love because I loved my mother even more so the worse she got, which is another codependent kind of thing. So clearly my love was malignant, toxic. I didn't understand. And so the first day that I went to see Father Andrew Foster at Church of the Ascension in New York City to sit down, I made an appointment to say, I think I have a vocation to the priesthood. And we sat in this little office and he didn't laugh. He didn't scorn. He didn't put me through the paces. His name was Father Andrew. He said, that's wonderful, Mark. And he said, I'm not surprised to find you here saying this to me. And we talked for a few minutes. and we talked for quite a while. He was so loving and accepting and confirming. And then I got up out after that meeting was over, and I walked down the hallway of this old building on 10th Street, actually entrance on 11th Street. And I got to the top of the stairs, and I was about to go down the stairs, and they're these twisty old, hazardous stairs. You could never build them in this day and age. So you have to be careful. You have to be careful going down them. And so I stopped for a moment at the top of the stairs, and I was overwhelmed with the feeling and the knowledge that I loved God, that I really, really loved God. And I believed and had always believed that God loved me, but I didn't know what it felt like to love God. But I did in that moment. When someone looked at me and said, I see God at work in your life, then I could love God. So, and I've never forgotten that moment. I can tell you exactly where it happened. I could tell you what every moment felt like. And so feelings and faith are deeply connected, and they're connected in the moments that you're talking about, when there's nothing left but faith, because life is ebbing, life is going.
That's why, when people, and I'm sure they've said this to you, like, I wish my faith was like yours. I wish I had faith like you. And I don't know, it's like, I don't want to deny what they're telling me and say, like, I believe you do. Like, I believe it's just trust that you're afraid of or something. But I think, that's the other piece of it, that what you just described of, that's when you realized how much you loved God, because a human being affirmed you and said, you belong. This call belongs with you and in you and is a part of you and is real. And I see it. I see you. I see you. I see you as Father Mark Collins now, which means he had already seen something before. So this is why I believe we actually do walk across a threshold, or as so many people say, darken a door of a church. We are longing for feeling something that connects with acceptance, belonging, affirmation, being seen. And, just as we put a very high bar on our parents, because as you just said, we want them, they are the superheroes in our life for a significant period of time. We have that same high bar when we walk into this place we called sacred, where, it's been around for forever. And there's a million reasons why it's intimidating and literally designed to make us feel small, for some reasons that are good and for some reasons that I don't think are very good. So part this is just why I'm fascinated with this idea of, how do we talk about Jesus shared this human nature? This is exactly what, when we use this fancy word incarnation, that's a beautiful word, and yet leaves me feeling dead inside, if I'm honest, right? Like, there's no incarnation as a word, doesn't really, it's just a word. And most people don't know what it means. But when I tell you the story that I told you, when you tell me the story you just told me, when I enrich my understanding of these sacred stories that we read all the time, over and over and over again, right? The same stories, they bring me to tears, or they make me laugh, or they fill me with this resonance that I'm like, how can I so relate to a story from like 1 AD?
Well, and those stories, and there's a reason why we didn't dig it up out of some dusty bin and say, hey, we should read these stories again. They've continued to be read. And, like anything like that, people continue to abuse them and say, oh no, this is a tool of my authority. This is a tool of my, my power and value. It's a way of me constructing power and values in the way that I would like to own power, and the way that I'd like to construct values. The problem I find the challenge I find with that is, right now, I feel like that our culture is so inundated with capitalism and transactionality that people walk in the door of our churches and are like, okay, I am here to feel good.
Yep. I'm here to consume something.
Right. I'm going to give you my time. I'm going to give you my part of my treasure. I'll use my talents in support of this church. But in exchange for that, I want to feel good at the end of the service. So, I have sermons where I make people laugh.
Sure.
And people love, oh, great sermon. Oh, I
Yeah.
really love that. And I have sermons where I make people cry and they don't say a thing. So and I try to talk to them. I've said before, I run into people and they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, I haven't seen you at church. I've been going through a rough time. And I'll be like, well, I have a phone. You don't have to just see me at church. And B, bring that here. If you show up in your pajamas with your pillow and lay in the last pew, you'll be the most authentic person in the door. Now, I know that's a challenge, and I know most people are not going to do that, but I'm hoping to create a space in which they can do that. And to realize that, as Irenaeus of Lyon said, the glory of God is the human being fully alive, not the human being feeling good, not the human being only being happy, not the human being having perfect faith that never experiences doubt. The human being fully alive, as you've talked about Jesus being, that has, resentment and anger and hatred and fear and all of those things, as in addition to joy and true happiness and peace. We exchange the peace every Sunday. It's our experiences of church and faith are meant to be transformational, not transactional, as I say over and over again.
Well, yes. And the church did a really good job of ensuring it was a transactional relationship that got established over time. So, this isn't like saying, oh, bad church. It's just, let's just own the reality of institutional life that is adhered to a capitalistic system. Inevitably, just as it was in Jesus's time, even though that structure wouldn't have been called capitalism, was transactional. You do these things and you get this thing. So,
well, it's the
same thing is a part of our world right now.
Yes, and as I often say to you at times like this, there is no institution except which we make. All human institutions are human made. They are the way they are, not for some other person whose other goals. They are part of us in the same way that it's just part of the sinful, flawed nature of human beings.
Yes, no, I agree.
And so they're the way that they, and then to get back to one of your other examples, when you leave a church at 14, when so much, you finally understand and you reject this whole system, you don't stick around for the part where you mature into that faith and that it begins to fit into a way you have of understanding your own value and your own personal power. And it can be transformational. You know how this is. People will say all kinds of crazy things that they think that we believe. They'll tell me all the time. I had in the early days of the pandemic, had a huge Facebook debate with a friend of mine who's like, well, I can't believe that you don't believe the Bible is the inerrant, perfect word of God. You have to believe that. And I'm like, I don't have to believe that. And I don't believe that. And he's like, but I'm, basically saying, but I've spent a whole lifetime rejecting the church and being really, really angry at it because it's what made my family reject me. I was like, your family rejected you because of plenty of other reasons. That wasn't the only reason. But he's like, no, you must believe these things or you're not really a priest. And then I can't hate you and reject you. And I'm like, I don't believe those.
Well, and that's kind of, any sort of black and white dualistic either or way of looking at, and the same thing is true for the institution. I have no problem saying the institution created the problem we live in. The reason nobody goes to church is because we create, you're saying like we create the community. Yeah. That's exactly right. That's exactly what we did. And at the same time, I have no doubt that you and I in our tiny little mustard seed communities create transformational experiences. And people also go there for transactional experiences. And who's to say where God
Very
does
many.
not participate in that. There's many things I do where we're going to do something, you and I do it at church. We're not going to see that person again after we baptize a baby, after we have a funeral, after they stop by, because this was a church they used to attend when they were 12 years old. But you and I aren't God. God's connected with them in a much bigger way than you and I are. And certainly one of the things you have invaluably helped me with in terms of my own growth is recognizing it doesn't serve me to utilize any of that anger towards the institution. And I completely adhere, and I try to live out, because I intellectually adhere, but don't always live out, Richard Rohr's summary of St. Francis theology: the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
How
yeah.
can we get to yes? This is what happens, people. Ariane calls Mark when she's confronting something that is pissing her off in her job. And Mark calmly sits on the phone and says, well, Ariane, sometimes he'll say, Mother Ariane,
just to piss you off.
How can we get to yes? And sometimes, and that's become a mantra when I'm dealing with people that I really want to just say no to, because that's not who I want to be.
Yep. And there's so many people, but there's so many people like my friend I had the Facebook debate with to say, you have got to be a person I can say no to. Give me some ridiculous belief. Give me some, anti-human sexual ethic. Give me something so I can reject you. And I'm like, if you're rejecting me, and this circles back to my understanding of, there is no us, there is no, us and them. There's only us. It's only us. We are all us. And we struggle to find that. I mean, in terms of politics and racial inequality, all of that stuff. There's only us. So when you have a gay child, you're like, I don't want to know more about my sexuality. Don't make me consider a different one so that I have to then examine my own. All of that stuff. There's only ever us. But the human ego is that's my question for God. Tell me about this ego and why we have it, because most of the time it just causes me problems. It just causes me problems.
Such a good question for God. We could have a whole question because, as you know, Mark, my entire thesis at seminary was based on Freud's description of the ego, superego, and id, and how that informs understanding our interior way in which we influence our understanding of Scripture and Jesus, which I realized today, by the way, before this conversation. Don't you realize as a priest and as a growing human being, you keep coming back to the same points of both interests and new learnings? Like the kind of the thing that's fueled you from the beginning, you just keep returning to over and over and over again.
Well, you do keep. I think each of us has a great question we're trying to answer.
Yes, that's a beautiful thing. A great question we're trying to answer.
And we, whatever we choose to experience, whatever we're intentional about, is an attempt to answer that question. And for me, it's been, recovery and therapy and faith and ordained life, and doing this thing that the truest thing you can say about me is, my idea of the perfect existence is to be a sonnet. Give me a structured 14 lines.
Yeah,
with
that's why you and I love church. We love structure.
And then let me write my own words in there. And it's okay. I'll accept the discipline of the framework, but I want to say a new thing in there. And so here we are. We walk this way of, tradition and making something completely new within that tradition. And, other people need to stand outside the tradition and never darken the door of it. And other people need to, whatever they do with it. But I know this is, and my great question, whatever it is, I'm not even sure I know what it is, but I'm trying to answer with my intentional methodology of accepting the framework, trying to make something new within the framework that's meaningful for me.
And I think our shared place of resonance and the reason you and I were attracted and called into becoming priests, the framework's been a part of our healing. So we've been able to
Yes.
walk into a different type of family, which is the church, and come, and not as children, but as adults who are trying to be adults. Father Mark Collins, like one day I remember you telling me, like, Ariane, the most important job we have is to simply be the parent in the room at all times.
Yeah. Be the non-anxious, love you no matter what, the
Clarity is kindness. Yes.
parent, idealized parent.
Just do it. But that's why I think, the framework of church works really well for us, and we have thrived because it's provided stability, structure, a methodology for making sense of our lives, for making sense of our woundedness, and ways to assign meaning to some very difficult experiences, and to also find redemption and, resurrection and all those incarnation, these words, they only have meaning, I think, well, for me, because I could tell you a story of how all of those words have been real for me.
We, two things about that, just because it's been in the news lately. So here we are talking about our life inside this structure, right? And meanwhile, yesterday there was an announcement of Prince Harry's memoir coming out.
Wow.
Someone who grew up in a highly structured environment. Unlike us, our environments were chaotic and unstructured and unreliable. His environment that he grew up in was so completely structured, right? And I mean, when I think about that kind of existence, I'm like, okay, wait, I have a job, I have a title, I have an income. I just have to show up and be nice every once in a while. I'll take it. It'd be so much. To me, it seems like, somebody's going to give me the answers to my great question, right? But he that's not been. He's had to reject the whole thing in order to sort of find his path. So it's different for everybody. It's not for everybody. It's not. Right. It's definitely not for everybody. But I'll share this one thing with you, that this had spiritual direction last week, and it was so interesting because many of the questions you're answering, my spiritual director was asking me, because I'd just been to see my father, and he's like, what's that father and father God thing like for you? And we talked about that, and he it's funny, I told him, I said, I don't really have any expectations of God. I'm not asking, I don't think God is gonna wrap something up for me and put it in a bow. God created me and gave me a creation to exist in, and wishes me well, I'm sure, but I don't, that's not how I've learned. I've not learned to expect things from a father figure, so I don't. And he said, "Well, gosh, what about what about the resurrection? Don't you have expectations of what? Isn't that an expectation that you would experience the resurrection yourself?" And I said, "I don't have to believe. I don't. It's not. I feel like I cheat because I've had a resurrection in this side of the veil. I've lived that. I was dead and didn't even know it, and was able to come back to life when I was able to recover, and not just recover, but not just regain a life, but to be given the gift of being able to live that life." That's really something, to give yourself the freedom and to find the space in which you can construct and build, and you both are the engine of, and the person who steers that life is a pretty amazing gift from God. So I know what resurrection is.
And in the words
of
the woman who, has influenced the language I utilize often, owning our story is one of the bravest and most courageous things we can ever do. And it's all in the service of becoming the author of our story.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So with this, my friend, I'm going to draw us to a close. And you just talked about your spiritual director. Some people utilize the phrase a spiritual companion. And that's exactly what my faith in my feelings around creating this podcast is, that these can be conversations to companion people, to just be a supportive, loving, encouraging voice in their ear to say, you are a spiritual being and you are a feeling human being, and everything about your human nature is divinely, wonderfully, beautifully made and has been knit together by such a powerful love, capital L. And I just want to encourage people. And you certainly encourage me, as you well know. We're not going to go into the BFF Love Fest right now, but thanks for taking time to be on this conversation.
Well, just like God, I'm absolutely delighted in you, Marianne. So thanks for letting me be part of this next conversation. I noticed that you didn't add that I was back by popular demand.
Oh,
but I'm sure it was.
That's what I forgot to say in the opening.
Yeah, I think I scripted that for you, didn't I? That overwhelming demand for Mark Collins to come back and talk.
That's what it was. I forgot. Silly me. All right. Well, okay. Next time.
Well, as long as you demand me that I come back.
This will be the conversation that sends me off into the stratosphere. I'll be meeting Joe Rogan after this.
Oh, what good company you keep.
Yeah. All right. Till next time, my friend.
Thank you.